He called it the fourth way because he essentially is taking all that knowledge from all those schools, combining them, and trying to find practices that affect the mind, body, and heart at the same times. It takes really long when you go one of the ways instead of all three of the ways at once.
I also loved his idea that no belief is required.
So there's a practical element involved with it. He told people that faith is not required because he wanted you to experiment with these ideas.
This is not a passive philosophy in any way, shape, or form.
It's all about understanding, but also in some sense befriending your different centers to get them on your team.
What resonates with me is the need for a very high sense of agency.
Try to understand yourself so that you can, understand the world better.
Well, hello, everybody. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. Today's guest actually got me to reread The Philosophy of the Fourth Way. I discovered your account on Twitter because you are actually one of the best memers I have ever come across. They are often both very meaningful and yet also quite humorous. We're going to get into the power of symbols later on. But then I discovered your YouTube channel as well, in which you talk at length about the philosophy of the fourth way, which was developed by George Gurdjieff and Peter Uspensky, two very fascinating men who I did a lot of research on. The ultimate aim of the fourth way is to achieve a higher state of consciousness and self-awareness, leading to a more fulfilling life. In many respects, very, very practical, almost William Jamesian in its practicality. But welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So let me ask you first about the memes that you put up on Twitter. I honestly think you're one of the best accounts in terms of the memes that you create. Walk me through that. I know how they kind of relate after doing a lot of research to the fourth way, but they don't always. And
Yeah.
Walk us through those before we get into looking at the fourth way.
Sure. Well, it actually has something to do with the fourth way in that I kind of take some of the things that Gurdjieff mentions about how it's a sort of alchemy, essentially, where you take, he had this phrase called impressions are food. And what that means is, the certain types of impressions create, almost like chemistry or alchemy, have a different reaction with the different sensations in your body, the food that you're taking in, and the air you're breathing in, and also the impressions that you take in are all combining to create new, mixtures of different, forms of chemicals. And, different types of food, for example, higher forms of philosophy, higher forms of religion, things that come from a certain, what you call the higher intellectual center or the higher mental or the higher emotional center. Those types of metaphors, mythology, all this kind of stuff is just wrapped up in this idea of information density. The right type of information density almost creates almost like neuroplasticity or, kind of better connections among the neurons. I think, different things that can alter your mind to think differently, get you outside of the normal dualistic way of thinking and try to add, a different element in it. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do with the memes in a sense, and the, different things that I post is to try to alter the perception of reality just a little bit, make people see things differently.
And that was also one of the goals of Gurdjieff. Yeah, he liked that idea of a shock,
Exactly.
to interrupt what he would say your sleeping state. I guess. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Exactly.
one of the things that he and Uspensky focus on, I find it interesting. It's kind of a fusion of Eastern and Western mystical thought, with Gurdjieff being more Western in his outlook, Uspensky being more Eastern. And that's kind of how they got to calling it the fourth way, right? The three other ways: the way of the body, the way of the monk, the way of the mind, and then the combinatorial way. Educate us, and me especially, and hopefully our listeners and viewers on how they work their way up to the fourth way.
Sure. So one of the interesting things that I found about Gurdjieff, and this kind of made me, when I first discovered it, I kind of took a deeper dive once I started to kind of understand where he had come from, because he had come from a long line of different mystery schools from different religions. And he had also managed to team up with a bunch of people that were also interested in similar things. He called them the Seekers of Truth, I believe. And he said that one person alone could not have learned what he learned in those mystery schools. They all combined their knowledge and all went to different mystery schools, and they all came back and kind of combined all of their knowledge into these different systems. And what he discovered was, while all of these different mystery schools focus on different things, they were all basically connected. There was some type of ancient teaching that connected all of these different mystery schools, and he was wanting to bring that out. And what he discovered, and this leads us back into how he called it the fourth way, because he kind of divided all of the mystery schools up into three basic types of schools. You had the fakir type of school, which mainly focused on the body, improving the body. It basically trying to establish your will through the body. And, that was often done by, some of these yogis would, spend, 30 years with their hands above their head, or, something like that. It was an act of will devoted to, whatever God, they were, devoting that action to. And then he said sometimes what would happen with those types of people is that once they gained a degree of will, they would be taken out to a yogi school, which is a school of the mind. And they would be taught in the ways of the yogi. And knowing that since they had developed a will, they could progress more quickly through the school of the yogi. They were a good candidate for that. But he said the downside of that is that it takes really long. When you go one of the ways instead of all three of the ways at once, you're slowed down in your development, because you get really developed in one center. And then it's like you have to start all over. Kind of like the guy who developed will in the body. He goes to the yogi school, the school of the mind, and he basically has to start all over. But it may be quicker for him now that he's developed the will. But that's kind of how that works. And then the second school is the school of the emotions. That's almost like the way of the monk. There's someone who's like praying to God, trying to connect their emotions to a higher source. But again, the downside to all three of these ways, the way of the mind, the way of the yogi, which is the way of the yogi, the way of the emotions, or the way of the body, is when you don't combine them, your development can stall, it can get off center, and then you have to, basically start all over. So he called it the fourth way because, he essentially is taking all that knowledge from all those schools, combining them, and trying to find practices that affect the mind, body, and heart at the same time. So, exercises that try to combine those into one exercise instead of, having to basically, learn from scratch, 3 times in a row for all 3 sitters. And he thought that's why he called his center the Center for the Harmonious Development of Man, because he saw that we have all these different parts to us, and it matters how you advance each part and the ratios, and you don't want them to get too far apart, or else you'll have an imbalanced, kind of type of inner structure. So that's what the fourth way was all about, is trying to create this harmonious way to develop internally.
And I was struck when I was going back over everything. They have what they call the laws of 3 and 7. The law of 3 is the triad is kind of an active force, then that is confronted by a passive force, and there's a reconciling force. By way of example, if you want to actively change a way that you're living, that would be the active force. The passive force might be a habituated way of behaving that is going to offer resistance to that. And then the reconciling force would be your being able to work with those two to come up with a new way of doing it. It struck me as being so similar to Hegel's dialectic, where he's got the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Was a lot of this based on some of the more traditional philosophers?
Certainly, Gurdjieff was familiar with the philosophers, and Ouspensky definitely was. But how much of it was taken from what is really hard to tell, because Gurdjieff was a very mysterious, type of character, and he never exactly said where his sources came from. And even some of the places that he did say that they came from, historians are still kind of not really sure if he was just saying that as a teaching, tool, or whether he was actually serious. So there is a good bit of mystery behind where exactly did some of his ideas come from, and how much of them were his own modifications, and how much of them were, what he learned straight from the source. So yeah, that's a tough question.
Yeah, and I just see similarities everywhere to many people that I've read. Like Jung, for example, said, until you make the unconscious conscious, you will look at your life and call everything that happens to you fate, right? And what I liked about Gurdjieff was it just seemed to be like the best time to start is now, right? So don't worry yourself about where you've been. Start now. I also loved his idea that no belief is required. That's very unusual in these sort of philosophical enlightenment courses and philosophies. And the other thing I like very much is action, and aim is critical, right? You've got to, this is not a passive philosophy in any way, shape, or form. And it requires that you, basically pay attention to yourself, right? In terms of self-auditing your thoughts, because he kind of basically says that there are, 4 ways of being. The first is kind of being asleep. For our social media fans, that would be the classic NPC, just sleepwalking through life. Then there's waking sleep, in which he puts the vast majority of people. In other words, we're doing things on autopilot. We are not self-remembering. We are not analyzing our thoughts at all. We're just going through the motions. Then self-remembering, and this is what I want you to talk about, because he says this is the key toward taking the first step toward awakening and discovering objective consciousness, which he views as the highest state. But let's start at let's assume that maybe a larger percentage of people who are fans of infinite loops might be in the self-remembering part. But let's take it from waking sleep, where we find the vast majority of humanity, and then talk a bit about his idea of remembering and getting to this objective consciousness.
So I guess probably the best way to start, because there's a lot of ways we could get into it, but is this idea of Gurdjieff calling mankind asleep, or he would frequently call people machines, meaning, just very automatic reactions to things. And his idea was that we were essentially hypnotized to act in certain ways, and it was essentially a problem of consciousness. One of the interesting things about Gurdjieff as well is, from his background, he was not just someone who studied a lot in these spiritual schools, but he also at times was a professional hypnotist, and he could hypnotize people. And, a lot of people came to him for, your typical, I want to stop smoking, or I want to stop eating as much, or, those types of, standard things that you go to a hypnotist for. But in his hypnotism, he really learned a very hands-on way of how the subconscious actually functions. And he noticed that we have all these different, essentially, sub-agents within us that are always fighting. And, one of the key problems he said that humanity faces is that we label ourselves a certain name, like Andrew or something like that. But really, we've got 100 different people in us that all call themselves Andrew, and they're all fighting for control. And and he would also say things like, you know, psychology, you can't start with psychology because psychology applies to people who are relatively stable and solidified. You have to really think about mechanics first. And the mechanics of the unconscious and how it reacts to things are paramount. So you have to be aware of all of the different sensations, all the different motivations within your psyche, all the different things that we normally have these things he called buffers, which are essentially psychological tools to get us to see things the ego's perspective. Like if someone were to cut you off, you would immediately blame the other person and get mad. Oh, they cut me off. How dare they? Blah, 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 blah. Not seeing that it was some type of internal motivation, some type of internal anger that you haven't dealt with that caused you to do that. Your buffer directed it toward someone else. So that's step one. You have to notice your buffers. You have to notice the things that you don't want to see about yourself. And then as you start to understand yourself, you start to gain some self-knowledge. What happens is that you have all these different, subagents, these different brains, he called them, within you. So you've got, and science, I think, has proven that medical science, that we have a heart brain that thinks on its own. We have a gut brain that thinks on its own. Our mental brain thinks on its own. All these different brains are fighting each other for control of our identity, essentially. And we have to notice and integrate those aspects of our subconscious, almost like Carl Jung going through the individuation process. We have to take all of those various subagents and we have to unite them into a common whole. And I think it also has to do a lot with, I'm sure you're familiar with like the master and his emissary and like the left brain, right brain, and how they also have different ways of viewing the world. And that's another area that has to be, reconciled. So you have all these different perspectives in the brain, and you have to, self-remembering is all about noticing those different motivations, noticing those different reactions that you have, and then trying to combine the attention of the centers into a commonality. So, he would, it's all about, understanding, but also in some sense, befriending your different centers to get them on your team, to get them, to understand that it's actually better for them in the long run if they cooperate rather than trying to get things done their own way. But in order to do that, you have to kind of learn the language of these different centers because they all kind of speak a different language and we don't speak it generally. And we think that we do. We come up with all these reasons, all of these, thoughts in our brain as to why we're acting this way, but we haven't actually listened to what's actually going on down there. So we don't actually know what it's trying to tell us. But once we start listening, once we start remembering ourselves, we start to speak the language, and then we can have a dialogue of, this is the best way to do this, try to be more aware. And then, true self-remembering is that, up until, you get to a certain point, you're really just attempting at self-remembering and trying to be persistent at it, knowing that you're probably not doing it right. But the more that you persist, eventually you get to a point where it starts to become more automatic and you start to unite the attention within the centers. So you're constantly engaged with your heart, you're constantly engaged with your body. And so when a psychological trigger comes, you're already there. Your attention is already locked in and you can respond in a way that you choose instead of having that done for you, which is the way of hypnotic sleep. When it's all about your triggers. Something happens, you react. Something happens, you react. You get in a bad mood. You do, you yell at someone, whatever it is. There's a lot of different ways you can react, but when the trigger comes in, if you have the inner stability, you have the different centers on your side, then you start to change the way you act. You start to change the way you see things. And that, literally changes everything. And that's, Gurdjieff described that as, kind of gaining new, you gain new abilities, you gain new, a level of consciousness, and there are he described different levels of how far up you can go, but um, it's really just a system of transformation. And he kind of made different analogies and different ways of looking at alchemy, looking at psychology, mythology. He just, combined all of these different fields of study into this, very systematic approach that you can take it in pieces, but when you start to look at it holistically, it forms, much larger mosaic. So
The thing that I find fascinating as I was rereading and then looking at notes that I've made is, for example, I love Walt Whitman, right? And his classic line, "I contain multitudes," seems to really vibe with the outlook in the fourth way. The other one that really fascinated me, and I was just like immediately ran back to my notes on Nikola Tesla, right? He basically said that we are all one. We are only separated by ego, beliefs, and fear. But then he also was hinting at, hey, you want to know the keys to the universe, you need to understand energy, frequency, and vibration. And sometimes he would say, he would refer to them numerically, right? If you want to know the magnificence of the universe, you have to understand the 3, 6, and 9. And in a similar way, the fourth way looks at the law of 3 and the law of 7, right? And I think that this idea of trinities showing up, triads showing up everywhere, I find really fascinating. But if you, and of course, the law of 7 or the law of octaves, right? That's all the way back to Pythagoras, who basically developed a cult around the idea that the music of the spheres, I guess we would call it today, was a great way to understand things. But talk a little bit about this idea of the law of 7 and the law of 3. I was really fascinated. 3 is pretty easy because it's the active force, passive force, reconciling force, and it corresponds to the 3, the way of the body, the way of the monk, the way of the mind. But I'm fascinated about the law of octaves. Talk a little bit about the law of 7, and then bring in what you need from the law of 3 to help our listeners and viewers understand.
Sure. So the law of octaves was essentially how he thought the entire universe operated. And pretty much everything could be divided into vibrations, which can be divided into different ratios of patterns. So, and that is the scale of the octave. So, I believe he called it the law of heptaparsha. I'm butchering this name, but heptaparsha or something like that. He got some name that he made up for this law, but he combined this in the Enneagram. So you have essentially the law of 7 and the law of 3 make up the Enneagram. And the law of 7 is the law of motion. So it's how you're moving through, pretty much anything, like a musical scale. And what's interesting about and how this applies to the law of 3 is the law of 3 corresponds to something that he called shocks. Shocks are essentially something that is outside of the normal octaves, the normal pattern of octaves. It's almost like in a musical scale, you go up by whole steps, except for when you go up by a half step. To him, that would be the shock. You're changing the pattern slightly, and now you have to. He essentially envisioned the law of octaves like a circle, and so you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 around the circle, and at certain points you're advancing. So let's say you're going up to 1, you're going up to 2, and then at 3 you get a shock. So what happens in this point is the shock can either be overcome and you keep going up the octave, or if you do not have the energy to essentially bridge the gap of the shock, then the octave starts going in reverse and you start falling. So you have this, pattern of ascension, and then the shock comes, and then it sends the thing either in a higher direction or in a lower direction. And that's the way that he thought pretty much everything worked. And he essentially divided up the universe into these different levels of cosmoses. So you have and I think he numbered them 1 through 7, and they're all essentially like fractals. They're nested within one another. But you go down, to the very atomic level, all the way to the, giant, the solar system or the universe at the macro level. But then you have all these levels in between. And we're kind of at the, just kind of like we're the seventh, or, the third planet away from the sun. I believe that we're also the third, level of those octaves of the nested universes going up and down. And it's kind of our job, he also had this, huge cosmology. So everything that he did on the cosmological level, he did on the internal level. So everything was supposed to mirror each other. So everything you learn about cosmology, you could also apply to your inner development as well. And he thought that they mirrored each other. So that's the other thing that's interesting as well. So when you look at the law of octaves, we have, just like a musical scale has the law of octaves, and just like the universe has the law of octaves, we also have the law of octaves. We're made to ascend the octaves, but we have to overcome the shocks in our lives in order to ascend to the next level. So that's, it's kind of metaphorical, but it's also, he thought literally how the universe worked. So.
Yeah, and he called it the ray of creation, right? With the absolute, the highest level of consciousness. What strikes me is just the similarities with so many other spiritual or enlightenment studies and actions. Like, I was reading that, and then of course you immediately think of the unnamed Tao, which is the mother of all things, right? The named Tao, the unnamed Tao cannot be described. The named Tao is the mother of a million things, but it's also really similar to Brahman being universal consciousness. He creates Atman, right? Because he which is him, but he takes his memory that he's Brahman away. And then you move on to the kind of the Christian hierarchy as outlined by Thomas Aquinas. And you've got the same thing. It's divided into 3 triads, the angels or spheres. The first is the cherubims and seraphims and thrones. The second is dominions, virtues, and powers. The third is angels and archangels. I'm fascinated by the way all of this, as I review all of the notes like that I've made as I've studied these things, start to seemingly say the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I am an inveterate rabbit hole diver. And one of the things that I started thinking a lot about was I'm not traditionally religious in any sense. I'm not an atheist because I think that requires an equal or greater amount of faith than traditional believers in religion. And I think the world's a lot weirder than most of us think it is. But I started to sort of think about the biblical stories, and basically they're all metaphors, right? And the idea that all of these I am statements in both the Old and New Testament really led me towards, I wonder if they mean not I as in I am Jim, but rather I am the shepherd, I am the door, I am the Alpha, the Omega. God answered Moses, I am who I am, buddy. and I wonder whether that actually means I am consciousness, right? I think that this idea that, and not to go all the way to like panpsychism, you could, but just the idea that maybe this idea that things are external. You use the example of when somebody cuts you off in traffic, and you son of a bitch, you bastard. You point the finger at the other person, right? We all do that endlessly. And one of the things that I've learned, or think I've learned, I probably haven't, not entirely, but the desire to make anything that goes wrong in your life somebody else's fault I think is incredibly detrimental to both your own growth, your own outlook in life, everything. And when I look at these two, I'm also really struck by when you look at their characters, right? Gurdjieff and Opensky. What's really interesting to me is they seem yin and yang, right? You have Gurdjieff much more Western oriented, much more action oriented. You have Upensky much more Eastern oriented, much more kind of life of the mind. And it's putting those two guys together that creates this really interesting combination in terms of the way that they look at the whole, right? And one of the things that I found fascinating, I actually did a thread on it based on somebody else's idea of the thinker and the prover. We can think whatever we want, right? And the minute we decide that something is true or something is us, then we kick it over to the prover. And the prover's only job is to prove that we're right. And so, like, I'm a huge fan of Robert Anton Wilson, and he had this great quote, which is, the sad man lives in a sad world. The angry man lives in an angry world. The hopeful man lives in a hopeful world. And one of their big things in the fourth way, which is another similarity I found to William James, is this idea that you can reprogram your brain, that we are living life mostly on autopilot. We have to do this self-remembering and observing of our thoughts, our physical feelings, our emotions, not just our thoughts. But I'm wondering, when you reference the hypnosis, I've been fascinated by hypnosis, and I think that, like, I think that there is something to this idea that essentially socialization, indoctrination, is kind of a form of hypnosis. What do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And even the way they just said that hypnotism works is by basically you tell one of your sinners something, and then it will block out the other sinners. So, like, for example, you tell the emotional center, no more eating ice, no more eating your feelings, or whatever. And then, when it comes time to do that, the emotional center, will not listen to, the body that's hungry or the mind that's sad. It will just not do that thing, and so that's kind of what happens to us on a normal level too, except it's not put into us by hypnotists. It's put into us by the collective unconscious, or, whatever you want to call it. But, some type of experience that we've had. And then, let's say, our body has a negative reaction to something, and it, suddenly we just can't do that thing anymore. Or, we hear something, some piece of information that makes us hate, a certain celebrity, or, it makes us, feel resentful against, someone, one of our family members or something like that. And suddenly that, that piece of us develops a personality. It develops its own kind of wants and fears and desires outside of, the scope of what we're consciously aware of. And that's what causes those reactions whenever we're triggered by something. So it's a form of hypnotism, I would say. Maybe we're a little more awake than we are when we're sitting, being hypnotized by a hypnotist in the chair, but we're always walking around taking in information. And that information is affecting us in some way. It's like garbage in, garbage out. If you take in this information, it's going to be sitting there in the back of your mind. So it is, important that you are careful what you take in, but also that when you are taking in information, you're very aware of how you're taking it in, and exactly what it's doing to your psyche, because you can take in information in different ways. And this is something that, Ian Gilchrist, says very strongly as well. Is the way that you attend your world is how the world appears to you. And it's literally how you shape your world. And I think it almost has like implications in the quantum realm as well. The way that you collapse the wave function, the way you think about things is the way that things, you can literally alter your reality by changing how you view something, I think. So
that's the other commonality that really fascinates me. I've been fascinated by quantum physics since I was a teenager. It feeds. I've been fascinated by Taoism since I was a teenager. William James on the more practical side, and I try to keep an open mind to things like manifestation, right? And I think that so much of it just sounds very woo woo, but if you get down and if you just kind of like clean out like Hercules, clean out the stable, the Aegean stable, there are some pretty standard, very non woo woo things at the center of all this, right? It's kind of like the Buddhist notion, you become what you think you are, right? And that's kind of the way that I guess Gurdjieff would call it. Esoteric knowledge means objective knowledge. And he talked quite a bit about the mysteries. And in fact, I think that was the title of the first book, right? By Uspensky wrote the most famous book about Gurdjieff, In Search of the Miraculous.
Right. Yeah.
And which of the various books on this do you find the most, like if we're going to outline a curriculum for our listeners and our readers, and they're like, wow, this fourth way sounds really interesting. What would be your first, second, third steps for them to start taking?
That's a good question because it's such a very complicated blend of literature. It is kind of hard to know what to recommend because there's so much out there, and I could recommend that people start with Gurdjieff himself, but you kind of have to almost understand something about Gurdjieff before you actually start reading Gurdjieff, because the way his writing style is, he can be sometimes very purposefully opaque. And so to start off with, his probably most opaque book, which was his first book, Beelzebub's Tales, is just, he literally makes up like 500 to like 1,000 words that he just makes up. Like he spoke like 12 or 13 different languages. And so he would just take these concepts that didn't really exist, or if they did exist, he would put their own spin on them. And then he would take these combinations of different, Greek, Russian, English, all these kinds of different languages, and he would just make up a word. And then that was part of his, curriculum in a sense, was to try to throw out these bizarre words that you would have to actually spend mental power processing and trying to understand. And that would, he was all about the work. He wanted you to work for it. He said that he placed all of the keys in Beelzebub's Tales, but not all of them were near the locks. So, he wanted you to kind of dig into the book and kind of discover and try to get out of your normal way of perceiving the world in order to really, understand his work. So if you try to start off with Gurdjieff, you may end up just being really confused. The way I got into it was through Uspensky, because I kind of identified with Uspensky in a way because his journey was very similar to my journey, and I also had just started looking at the Enneagram personality system. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but when I started reading it, I'm a 5, by the way, and when I started reading it, I immediately noticed that Uspensky was a 5, and his whole mentality and his whole way of writing and thinking just like resonated so deeply with me. And I kind of had already started reading Uspensky when because he wrote some books previous to meeting Gurdjieff. And actually their tale is like super interesting. It could really be a movie. It's so fascinating, just the way that they met. And I'm sorry if I'm taking the long way to answer your question. I hope this is okay, but
no, it's absolutely fine.
So I immediately recognized Uspensky as a 5, and when I started reading the Gurdjieff stuff, I recognized that Gurdjieff was an 8, and a 5 to 8 is a 5's growth point. It's the action that we generally don't take because we're too busy studying. And so I think, Gurdjieff, meeting or Ouspensky meeting Gurdjieff was kind of like fate in a sense for him. That's his growth point at 8 to meet. And he was looking for someone just like Gurdjieff. He had gone to all these different mystery schools because he was this just very smart person who had read pretty much all the important works of Western literature. He had read most of the works of Eastern literature. He was part of the intelligentsia, which, it was kind of like the teapot of, 100 years ago. They were all these people who were sharing all of this mystical and scientific information, and they were holding conferences and all these kinds of things. And so Ouspensky was, pretty much at the top of the intellectual / spiritual, world at the time. He was, one of the forefront thinkers, and he had read all this, esoteric literature, all this scientific and philosophical literature, and he was still feeling like he was missing something. Like, what is the answer? Where, there has to be an answer somewhere where I can find more information, because I just don't feel like it's out there. And so his answer was, okay, well, there's got to be a mystery school out there that has all the secret information that I want to know. So he went on a journey. He went to India. He went to, different places looking for these different mystery schools. And he did find some, but they were, either they didn't, kind of jive with him, or a lot of them wanted him to take an oath of silence, so that he could not spread, these ideas. And that's exactly what he wanted to do, is to write about these ideas. And so he goes everywhere, goes around the world looking for them. He comes home defeated. And then a few months later, he meets Gurdjieff in Russia, where he lives. And it was just kind of like fate. And then Gurdjieff is like, hey, you don't need to go to India or wherever. I can teach you all the stuff that you're looking for. And so immediately he becomes a student. He actually puts Ouspensky through a test where it's kind of one of those classic guru tests where they try to trick you into saying something. Like, he told Ouspensky, he put him in a room and gave him a blank piece of paper, and he said, now I want you to write down everything that you know. And Ouspensky, labored on this for hours and couldn't write a single thing down on the piece of paper. And, and Gurdjieff kind of smiled and was like, okay, I'll take you as a student. And so he started his tutelage under Gurdjieff. And he immediately saw that this man knew way more than he did. And he was an intellectual of the highest degree, and Gurdjieff outclassed him by 100 to 1. And he was like, I can learn. So he says, I believe in Search for the Miraculous, that, Gurdjieff was a man who was so far above him, he couldn't even imagine being there. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't learn a lot from him. So it didn't even matter to him that he could never get to Gurdjieff's level. He was just going to learn as much as possible as he could from him while he could. And so Ouspensky, starts learning from Gurdjieff, and then eventually he starts introducing him to some of his fellow intellectual friends. And that's when Gurdjieff really becomes unleashed, in a sense, because he starts going from country to country, holding all these lectures. And, so many people are showing up, all these artists and intellectuals, and, pretty much the finest minds and thinkers and writers and poets. He was surrounded by all of these, musicians and different, high level people that were looking for something. Famously, you had someone named Maurice Nicoll, who was one of Carl Jung's closest students and friends. When he met Ouspensky in like 1921 or something, he pretty much sold everything and moved to France, where Gurdjieff was opening his institute, to learn from him. And so, you had Gurdjieff, attract all these, kind of intellectuals of the time. And a lot of them have also written things about Gurdjieff. So there's a huge amount of literature to choose from, both from his students and Ouspensky, and Gurdjieff himself wrote some books. So I think that Ouspensky kind of had the clearest intellectual take on Gurdjieff, in terms of, his systems and things like that. I don't think that Ouspensky ever truly got the emotional side of what Gurdjieff was trying to do. He resisted that a little bit. And that's kind of why I don't think he ever really got to Gurdjieff's level, is because he was so, just very five-like, just very closed off emotionally, and had a hard time opening that up. But intellectually, I think he was the best kind of um, students of Gurdjieff in terms of his system. So how I would start with getting into Gurdjieff would probably be to read The Fourth Way by Ouspensky, and then In Search of the Miraculous is kind of the other book I would recommend, because it takes you through the entire story of how Ouspensky and Gurdjieff met, and it also adds in different elements of the system as well. But that book is a lot more complex, but it's definitely very fascinating for someone who wants to dig in. And then Gurdjieff's books as well, once you kind of have an idea of the system, are very good, but you have to kind of take each one of them separately because they're very different in what he was trying to do. And then also that person that I mentioned, Maurice Nicoll, also wrote some psychological commentaries on the work that are very good. He wrote like 4 or 5 different volumes of psychological commentaries on the work, which are quite excellent. And there's a lot of books that have been written about him, in different avenues. But so you could really get lost in the literature. But yeah, so that's kind of, if I were to tell someone how to start, I would probably start with Ouspensky, maybe read a little bit of Nicoll, read a little bit of Gurdjieff's work. I wouldn't start with the first book Gurdjieff wrote, because that's definitely the hardest one to understand. The second one is probably the best way to start, because he kind of tells a little bit of stories about his life and stuff like that. And the third one is a little bit easier to read than the first one. So I actually started with the second one, read the third one, and then the first one, because the first one is just very, very dense and hard to understand if you're not already familiar with some of the ideas.
You're being very modest. I would also urge my listeners and viewers to check out your YouTube channel, in which you cover a lot of this. One of the other things that really struck me, then you were just talking about it, was I used the term well before word cell and shape rotator became popular. I used to call certain types of people symbol manipulators, and as I was reviewing this work, it really resonated with me that they kind of look at it, the Gurdjieff especially looks at that kind of the same way. The artists, the magicians, the shamans, if you will, are the ones who understand symbols, understand how to manipulate them, how much information they communicate and convey. Thinking like the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the Seal of Solomon, and that kind of made me start thinking about sort of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And then I came across a quote as I was reading by Einstein, where he says, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science." And yet, when I also think about like kind of the citadel of science, what rules there, it seems to me, is this idea of materialism, right? Which kind of sees humans as machines, sees the universe as dead and out there, and we are alive and here. But do you note that same sort of conflict when you look at traditional scientific materialism, which people like Rupert Sheldrake and a host of others have big issues with? I would certainly think that Gurdjieff and Ouspensky would as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think that science tends to focus on the abstraction. They deaden the world by taking it in silos. If you take a cup of water out of a river and you examine the cup, you can certainly see a lot of elements of the cup, but that's not the river anymore. It's all, they're taking some part of it and they're simplifying it down. They're taking the motion away, but you can't really tell the universe apart from the motion involved in it, because it's all just these, in my opinion, just all of this electromagnetic waves moving around. And so you can't ever really get the whole from the parts. And that's one of the things I think that science is a bottom-up system where they're looking at the parts and trying to reconstruct the whole. Whereas Chip's cosmology is a top-down system. You're working from a place of you already know that the world is a unity. It's only a matter of how now you divide it up, the ratios in which it is divided. Coming from a more top-down view, you can really get the sense of unity. And that's one of the things that how that ties into meth and symbols and all this kinds of stuff is Gurdjieff said, I believe, in one of his lectures to Ouspensky and in Search for the Miraculous, he starts talking about the mystery schools and how they used to teach people. And they would teach people through metaphors and symbols. And what they would try to do is, perhaps they would use some type of psychedelic drugs. Perhaps they would use some type of ritual, some type of chant, some type of singing, some type of, something, but something that would essentially evoke an emotional response that would send up this wave of emotions that would take the heart and mind and combine them and, up to the level of objective consciousness where you realize everything is one. And then once you've done that, then the student has evolved their consciousness to the point where they can understand the mythology and the symbols, and it all, kind of works psychologically, because all of these are essentially psychological tools in order to get you to advance your consciousness in some way. And that's what Joseph Campbell says in his ideas. I think he called it the 4 functions of the myth. One of the functions is to evoke in you the awe of the infinite mystery or something like that. And then the other one is to psychologically take you from one stage to another. And so the mystery schools knew how to do this. They knew how to create this sense of unity. And then they knew how to take that feeling of unity and understand how it, essentially manifests itself throughout the universe. And that's part of the Gurdjieff method. And he mentions, this is also mentioned, I think, in the Emerald tablets where they have, as above, so below, and all these other things. It's a mirror of the outside is always a mirror of what's inside.
It's kind of like Penrose's explicate and implicate order. What I find really interesting is you just find all of these similarities, even if you're studying like Penrose, looking at scientific things. David Bohm, same sort of thing. And then Gurdjieff's objective consciousness, which he looks at as the highest state. And I find it interesting because he says it's essentially a clear, unbiased, objective, and unblemished by personal biases, unblemished by the ego. And it reminded me of Philip K. Dick's line, which is, reality is that which, once you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And I really enjoyed that. But to get to that objective consciousness, like if somebody came up to you and said, wow, I love your channel, I love everything you're doing, how give me a little homework assignment. Tell me, how can I begin self-remembering?
Well, I'll give you a kind of a parable that Gurdjieff used, and maybe this will, help simplify the concept. So he compared the mind, body, and spirit to a carriage where you have the driver, you have the horse, and you have the carriage, and you also have the different lines connecting each to the other. I mean, you've got the reins that connect the horse to the driver, and then you've got the lines, the spindles or whatever they're called, that connect the wheels to to each other, and all these different parts. And so, and a lot of people, their different parts, their wheels are rusted, the reins, are old and moldy, and you have to do some work on your different parts in order to get them functioning correctly. So you have to take the horse, in this case, are the emotions, the carriage in this case is the body, and the driver in this case is the mind. And then you also have the master who's in the coach, but he doesn't speak until really the carriage is in good condition in some sense. So the driver has to be in line with the horse, and the carriage has to be working and doing what the driver says. And so we have to be very aware of the body. We have to be aware of the emotions. We have to be aware of the mind, and we have to get them on. We have to get them doing. Each of them has a job, and they have to be doing their very specific job. The body has to be um, usable and fresh, and has to be, responsive. And, above all, he said, the body needs to get the tension out. The more tension the body has, the better. So any way that you can learn to relax your muscles, especially the muscles in your face, the muscles in your body, the more relaxed and kind of easygoing and healthy your body is, the better. And then you have your emotions. Emotions are a difficult thing because we have a lot of negative emotions. And those are something that we have to observe very carefully, and we have to understand the roots of why we're feeling certain ways and get to the bottom of them, and really learn to face our emotional fears that we have, and learn to determine what is a legitimate thing that we need to work on, and what is just something our minds made up about a certain scenario that maybe we're projecting onto someone else, or we're projecting on the situation, where it's really something that we can fix within us. And then in terms of the mental center, we have to really clear out a lot of our misconceptions and kind of delusions as well. And we have to really, our mental center is really where we find our direction. So he said that it's very important to have an aim. That's like one of the key points of the system. Is the mind is the place where you set your aim. So you have to kind of understand what your body and what will be best for you in terms of your inner development. What should your aim be? And it needs to be an aim that's actually good. Like, I want to be the master of myself, or I want to be, a better person. Different aims, or you can have, different aims for different reasons. But the most important thing is that you have an aim, and that you're persistent in it. And then you can also bring your other centers on board. Your horse wants to go in that direction. Your carriage is able to go in that direction. Your mind is able to hold that direction, and without getting distracted, without, going into a ditch, or, something like that. And then once all of those centers are aligned, that's when it can hear the voice of the master. And the master will say, okay, now that we're on a road, go down to this castle down here that I own, or, something like that. You start to gain not just more autonomy, but you also start to hear the influence of the higher mental center, the higher emotional center, which will give you these different intuitions, impulses, whatever you want to say, that are of a higher nature, that will kind of point you in an even better direction sometimes. So, but the goal of the Gurdjieff system is, and this kind of relates in the sense, I don't know if you're familiar with that Rumi poem, "This Life is a Guest House," but it's very similar, where he also had a guest house analogy, where you had something called the deputy steward. And the deputy steward is kind of like a metaphor for the mind. So the deputy steward, the whole goal of the deputy steward is to get the servants that are in the house to actually do their jobs and stop griping, stop, fighting, stop stealing, kick the ones out that you need to, reform the ones that you can reform, but get the house in order. And once the house is in order, then the master's voice can be heard. The master will come back into the house and will start giving the deputy steward orders. And so that's kind of the goal of the system, because that's one of the problems, I think, sometimes with, you have these enlightened gurus, and they'll just say, oh, everything is one, and everything is love, and everything is beautiful, which is not a lie. That is true, but they don't necessarily give you a methodology of how to get there. Whereas this is kind of the methodology. Gurdjieff had a very specific, kind of methodology. If you get your house in order, if you put the deputy steward in charge, and then they can, in in a very like master and emissary way, then the deputy steward's job is to hand over control to the real master who can then come back. So you have this aspect of the self is kind of ordering itself, getting everything aligned, and then it's in a place where it can actually hear the true master who can give the real direction as to what that person should do. So yeah, I just threw like a bunch of metaphors out there, but hopefully that all made sense.
The thing that I find interesting is that if you strip away a lot of the esoteric part, right, it's actually a very pragmatic way and guide to not just spirituality, but to a lot of things in life, right? Like persistence, having an aim, having a purpose. Like if you want to be an entrepreneur, for example, you would do very, very well to study this, because when you I love your metaphor of the carriage and the horse and driver with the silent master sitting by, and as well as the deputy steward of the guest house. Oh, what it really boils down to, in my estimation, is kind of universal in the advice that it can give, right? So have a purpose, have an aim, understand the varying parts of the system. In this case, if we're looking at ourselves as people, right? There's the way the gut thinks, there's the way the heart thinks, there's the way the brain thinks, and integrating these things. Again, now we're kind of back to Jung, right? Where his whole deal was you really have to learn to integrate your shadow, integrate the unconscious part of your nature. And really, they're just sort of practically giving you a system for doing that. What the other interesting thing I found about these two guys is they seem really improbable together in many respects. Gurdjieff was like very charismatic, very extroverted, believed in doing things in groups, loved shock and awe, where Uspensky was much more in the mind, much more scholarly, more interested in life of the mind. But the part of this that's really interesting is that if you get to really understand what they're talking about and the system that they're presenting, it's ubiquitously helpful, right? It can be helpful in both your personal development, but if you're an entrepreneur or you're an engineer or whatever you are, right? Following this path, it kind of reminds me of, I'm a huge fan of Taoism. And in Taoism, it's everything is in a constant state of becoming, right? And that echoes Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. But the other idea from Taoism that I like, and Gurdjieff would probably agree with, is that life is movement. Without movement, you fall into stasis. Stasis is basically death. And when you look at what dies is that which can't change, right? Like Lao Tzu often gives the example of a tree, a really, really old tree branch that has snow accumulating on it. And it's so old, it's become brittle, and the branch breaks off and falls to the ground. And then he contrasts that with young trees or saplings, where when the snow hits them, you could double the snow, triple the snow, and they just bend. And then when the snow melts, they go back. Do you see similarities in the fourth way with things like Taoism, with things like pragmatism as advocated by William James?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like the whole Wu Wei, action within inaction or whatever it's called. Yeah, Gurdjieff used to have this saying, something like, "Here we don't create help; we can only create conditions." And to me, that almost sounds a bit like chaos theory, where how everything is, basically how the change of the system over time is completely based off the initial conditions. And really, you can only create those conditions within yourself. You can't actually, if you're focusing on the results of what you're trying to do, instead of the actual actions it takes in order to make that happen. That, that's the only thing that you have power over is the current conditions that you're working with. And so, really, he would also say, like everything in the world happens the way it has to happen. And so it's pretty much useless to think about how things could have been different. The only thing that you can really focus on is what is happening now. What can you change now? Because, maybe if you changed right now, you could change your future. But if you don't change anything, it's just going to keep going in the same direction. Creating the conditions while also having an aim. See, that's one of the things that is, it's hard for me to understand some days, because it's like you have to keep your aim while at the same time not expecting the immediate results from that aim happening. You have to focus on the very immediate, right here, right now. What is happening inside of me? How am I reacting? How am I behaving? Do I have the awareness of that or not? Or am I asleep? And that's something that, I kind of, at this point, you really have to be somewhat persistent in your self-remembering, but eventually you develop this alarm clock where you go, hey, was I asleep just then? Oh yeah, I've been asleep for like the last couple of hours, just kind of going around doing stuff, not really paying attention. But I do have this alarm clock that goes off more and more. It's like, oh yeah, it's like, wake up, like, pay attention. You're in control of the situation, even though, it appears that everything is not going well. You can still have control over your own actions, your own, how you approach the situation, how you treat others. All of that is within your control, regardless of the circumstances. And that's what I think Gurdjieff was trying to get out of his teachings, which a lot of his students just flat out did not understand. Like, I think a lot of the people like Ouspensky, they really wanted the intellectual side of it. They wanted to know the theoretical aspects of it without understanding the more practical aspects of it. And Gurdjieff would used to say this. I was actually just reading something where he was talking to one of his students, and he was like, "Oh, you Americans, you always want the answers for everything without understanding what I've already told you first." Because he understood that knowledge comes in stages, and that he can't tell you everything up front because you wouldn't understand it. He has to work you up. You have to progress in a certain, very specific progression of knowledge in order to truly advance your knowledge. And so if he tells you everything up front, you're not going to understand it. So there's a practical element involved with it, which is one of the reasons why he said, he told people that faith is not required, because he wanted you to experiment with these ideas. These ideas weren't just meant to be theorized over. They're meant to be literally practiced, to be experimented with, to try to understand understand yourself, so that you can, understand the world better, because the more you understand the world, the more you understand yourself. The more you understand yourself, the more you understand the world. And Gurdjieff knew that this was a kind of a back and forth process, and that if you tried to put all your focus, like Ouspensky, in trying to understand the world, you're not going to have that level of understanding because you don't fully know yourself. So you have to treat it like a, kind of this dual aspect, and one can't get too far ahead of the other, or else it won't fully, integrate that knowledge.
And one of the things that is a big takeaway for me as I read both of them is what resonates with me is the need for a very high sense of agency, right? And one of the things that I find threaded through all of these things that I've learned over my life is, if you have low agency, chances are your life is probably going to go not well, because you will be reactive. You will blame others. You will be, it's kind of like learned helplessness, in my opinion. And that leads to passivity and wanting other people to do for you as opposed to doing for yourself. And I just think that agency is such an important component of a well-lived life. And it doesn't have to be a life of commerce. It can be a life of learning. It can be a life of sports. It can be a life of art. It really doesn't matter. Back to the aim, right? If you have an aim that you can articulate and that you resonates with you, the only way to get there is to take action. And, ideas, the thing that separates a daydream from something that is actionable is that you can come up with a great idea. And if you do nothing and stay on your couch, it's just a daydream. But if you have an aim that you then take action against, that indicates that you have higher agency. And that seems to be one of the things that, as I study very successful people from a wide variety of careers, aspirations, etc., the one thing that really they seem to have is this persistence and a very high degree and sense of agency. What would you say to people that sort of believe that? I used to put up my own meme. You're the master of memes, so I defer to you. But I used to put up a picture of a guy who's got a cloud over his head and it's pouring rain just on him, and there's everywhere else is covered by sunshine, and the tagline of it is "Everything is luck," said the most unlucky man in the world. What sort of practical takeaways would you, if you were giving somebody advice on, hey, you really got to check out the fourth way. This is why I think it's good. Like, what would be your pitch? What would be your pitch?
So I would just say that it's a way for you to advance your state of consciousness, and I think that is ultimately, if you look, the reason I got into this form of philosophy, I guess you would say, is that I saw that I had these experiences that led me to believe that almost in a pantheistic way, that everything was essentially consciousness in some form or fashion. So if that is the baseline of reality, why would you not want to kind of increase your level of consciousness? I think that it's beneficial in multiple areas, but most importantly, it increases your satisfaction of life, which I think is really what we all want, is at the end of the day, is, not necessarily money, although that could be nice. It's not necessarily, the things or the status of life or whatever. We all just really want to be happy. And I think that one way of doing that is to advance your level of consciousness so that you have some agency over your life. You can direct your life. You can have some semblance of control over, where things are going. And I think that's, really good for everyone. One of the interesting things, one of the interesting ways you could do that, Gurdjieff had these, he used to say something to the effect of, the only magic is doing. And doing is what he described as, actually having some degree of agency over your life. So if you're just an NPC, if you're just going around, kind of half asleep and just allowing life to happen to you, you're not actually doing stuff. Even though you think that you're doing stuff, what's actually happening is you're just, you're responding to stimuli, and your, unconscious is kind of leading you around. I think, Carl Jung had this saying that, you will, if you're unconscious, fate will direct, or the unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it fate or something like that. I forget exactly the quote, but that's kind of how it works. If you're unconscious, you may run into the wrong kind of fate because of that unconsciousness. Whereas if you are conscious, you have some, kind of way to redirect your life in ways that kind of suit your own particular, life story, your own soul, your own higher self, whatever you want to call it. And the way that Gurdjieff said that magic was done is by combining your three centers into one kind of overarching motivation. So he called, there's essentially three elements. The body is the will, the heart is the wish, and the mind is the aim. So the mind sets the aim, the emotions set the wish, and the body sets the will. And if you can combine those three, that's what he calls doing, the ability to do, which is it's essentially manifestation in some sort, but he didn't really believe so much in the law of attraction as he did in, the universe will help you go in that particular direction if you're unified with your will, your wish, and your aim. And if you can kind of combine those three things into a unity, then you're someone who's able to actually do, which is to accomplish something not accidentally, but on purpose.
Yeah, that resonates very strongly with me. I think that you achieve things through taking action against your aims, as you just said, and trying to. The way I look at it is, happiness is more of a byproduct. I think people look for happiness like it's some external thing, and I think that it's much more what you just said. Happiness is a byproduct of taking action against your aims after having aligned in a holistic way all of the mind, body, and heart. What would be your pitch to somebody who's just like, I just do what I feel like doing at that particular moment, and I find that I go with the flow, baby, or things like that. I personally think that they can be integrated, but how would you get a person like that to get interested in the fourth way?
Well, it's interesting because Gurdjieff had this attitude, and I think the more I get into it, the more I kind of agree with him. He used to say something like, to those who do not wish to awaken, at least let them sleep well. And I think that Gurdjieff's work is really for those people who discovered that they want to wake up. They want this. And if you don't want it, there may not be convincing you. You have to actually want to work on yourself. You have to actually want to develop your consciousness. And there are some people that are happy as they are, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, I don't think I'm better than anyone because I do this thing, but I actually want to do this. And I think you have to have that motivation. He also used to say, like, the fourth way was for people who have tried and tried and tried all of the traditional ways and they can't find the answer. And the fourth way is for those types of people who they've been looking, they've been trying, they can't figure it out. And then this comes along and they're, it kind of, because what he said is ways are help. That's all they are. It's just help. So if you want the help, you can have the help. If you don't want the help, then, don't take the help. But you have to actually, for the ways to work for you, you have to actually want the help, need the help, take the help, implement the help. And then, eventually you have to kill the Buddha, in a sense. You have to throw away the system, once you've learned it, because eventually you can't just get wrapped up in it, because, the goal is to advance your consciousness, not to get stuck theorizing, a system like Ospensky did. The goal is to actually live your life more fully, to have a deeper knowledge, to have a deeper wisdom, to help yourself and others. That's the goal of, I think, at least myself and a lot of people who kind of take this path. But if that's not what motivates someone, I mean, I personally think it's a better way to live your life. But if someone's not interested in that, I really am not looking to convince people to take this road as much as I'm trying to get the word out that, hey, this is, if you're looking to improve your life, there are a lot of, helpful things here. So.
And it kind of resonates with Hesse's Siddhartha, the story where he goes through all of these various things, like the aesthetics, right? And, they drink their own urine and do all this kind of stuff, right? But then he just leaves because he no longer feels like he can gain any new knowledge from them. And I love that passage in that book because so many people miss that, right? They find some outer thing and they just want to dedicate themselves to that one thing. And that is like this external truth that exists over here. And in Siddhartha, no. I mean, it's like the story of the guy who goes in search of these great seekers, right? And he finds himself in this very remote monastery in the Himalayas, and he's sitting with the master, and he asked him point blank, he said, have all of your people stayed here? And the master said, most have, but a few have left and moved on. And the guy immediately gets up and says, which way did they go? He wants to follow the people who aren't content just, with this particular level of awareness or consciousness. He wants to find the seeker. And that's the other thing that attracts me to this is, and I completely agree with your assessment. You're not telling anyone they have to do this. No one has to do this. No one actually has to do anything. And the world just seems so filled with people who want to dictate to you, this is how you must live. This is the way you must follow this particular process. Not really. No, I mean, if you want to stay asleep, make it a good sleep. Have good dreams. And it just seems that some of the more recent mind viruses over the last decade or so have been these things where, I will tell you the only way that you can live is X, Y, or Z, right? And I'm very opposed to that, just in general, because who am I to tell you how to live your life? It's your life, not mine. And that seems like to be very much imbued in this philosophy. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating and great, and I thank you for reawakening me to this. I'd read it a while back, and I hadn't read it really thoroughly. So thanks to, first off, your great memes and your wonderful sense of humor. And that is that part of the shock that when you look into the fourth way, what you see there is a lot of you're a master of being funny, but also there's a shock there that makes people, it's kind of a little bit like you're reaching through the computer and hitting at people and saying, wake up a little bit.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. And just because I'm not necessarily trying to convince anyone to, awaken or, kind of go through the fourth way process or whatever, I do think that it's good to throw out a little bit of positivity, a little bit of different ways of thinking out into just the collective unconscious to get people thinking in a different way, to kind of elevate the conversation a little, or, kind of put some of these higher ideas out just like little seeds into the subconscious to see what grows. And, so that's, partially what I'm trying to do as well.
Well, I think you are succeeding at it because I absolutely love your stuff, and I send a lot of it to friends, and the feedback is always really interesting. It's like, wow, okay, I didn't think about it that way. Well, if you're familiar with Infinite Loops, you know that our final question, essentially, we're going to set you up as the emperor of the world. Now, we've just gotten done telling that we both agree that we don't want to tell or compel anyone else to do anything. But as emperor of the world, you can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do is we're going to hand you a magical microphone, and you can speak two things into it. And the entire population of the earth is going to wake up whenever their next morning is. And they're going to think to themselves, you know what? I've just had two of the greatest ideas. And unlike all the other times I've had these great ideas, I'm actually going to act on both of them. What two ideas are you going to incept into the world's population?
Idea one would probably be, I need to understand myself better, or we need to understand ourselves better as humanity. Like that idea, however you want to phrase that, but just the idea of something needs to change and it needs to start with us inside. The second idea would probably be to get rid of all the existing politicians and start from scratch.
Amen to that one, brother. Yeah. I think that we potentially, on both sides of the aisle, so I'm not playing favorites here. I guess I belong to what Bridget Fetisi would call a tribeless tribe, because I think we have like one of the worst political classes globally, not just in the US, globally, that certainly, if you're a big fan of history, it's hard to find other periods of time where the political class was so uniformly awful. And yeah, I love both of those. Well, thank you so much for being with us. People can find you both on Twitter and YouTube. They're very different accounts. The YouTube is more focused on the fourth way. And you're also doing some work with Enneagrams, right?
Correct. Yep. I do a little bit of Enneagram consulting, mostly personality stuff. So if anyone, wants a consultation or just, kind of tips on how to integrate the Enneagram into their kind of spiritual practice, that's what I'm all about. So
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was finally great to meet you and learn on.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Cheers.